Afternoon, everybody. This is John Wheeler with ITG. We're going to give it a couple minutes and we'll get started. So just stand by. Again, I want to say good afternoon to everybody. I see people are joining. Okay, give it a minute before we start, but just stand by. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Wheeler. I'd like to welcome you to our third webinar of the season. Today we are going to be talking about the new ISO 20000 2018 standard, which was just recently released. We're not going to go into great detail of specific clauses and all that, but what I wanted to do today was take an opportunity to sort of walk you through some of the structure of it, give you a general outline of how some things have changed, and then of course an overview of the standard. But we will have opportunities for questions and answers at the end. What I'll ask is, I believe you'll notice that on the controls here that if you have a question, you can certainly type it in. I'm not going to be stopping during the presentation. If you do have a question, just sort of write it down and submit it, and then towards the end, we'll set aside some time to do a little Q&A. And if I don't have an opportunity at the end to get to all of the questions, we certainly will collect them and we will distribute those questions out to the participants for today's webinar. Okay, so without further ado, I'm gonna move ahead. So as I mentioned, what we're gonna do today is I'm gonna point out and highlight some of the new changes to the standard and walk through a comparison of what the 2018 version looks like in comparison to the 2011 standard, and then also briefly talk about how the new 2018 standard maps to ISO 9001 and ISO 27000, and then also talk a little bit about schedule and timelines as it associates to the transition to the new standard. And of course, then we'll just talk a little bit about, systems management approach, some considerations, and then also the benefits of certification for those of you who are on the call that are on the webinar who don't have a certification for the company yet. Okay. So a little bit about us, Integration Technologies Group. We've been in the sector and providing consulting support for the better part of 30 years. Our company is both ISO 9001 2015, 20,000, 27,000 certified, and we also maintain maturity level rating 3 for both development and services in CMMI. A little bit about myself. As I mentioned, my name is John Wheeler. I've been a senior business process consultant for ITG for the better part of 4 years now. And before that, I come from a quality background as well as a program management background. And I am a certified auditor in all of the standards, as well as CMMI development and for CMMI for service. So, as we mentioned recently, the standard has come out. It was released officially on September 15, 2018. So what have they done? Primarily, the focus of the new standard is they are bringing it into line in what ISO, or the International Organization of Standards, or ISO, refers to as the ISO Annex SL. Okay, and this basically is a high-level structure of basically a universal structure, common terminology, an alignment with management systems in general. The new standard, for those of you who are ISO 9001 certified or ISO 27 certified, you'll notice that the new 20,000 standard falls right in line with the clause structure of the new ISO 9001 2015, as well as the ISO 27000. Okay, so this clause structure is Clause 4, which is the context of the organization, Clause 5, which is leadership, Clause 6 is planning, Clause 7 is support, Clause 8 operation, Clause 9 performance evaluation, and Clause 10 is improvement. Now, those are structure-wise similar to the other standards, specifically Clause 4 and Clause 5 with context of the organization and leadership is going to be pretty much in line, verbatim by definition and requirements. Where things get specific to the standard itself, the requirements of the standard specifically for a service management system, is in Clause 6, Clause 7, and Clause 8. Much like the ISO 9001, much like the ISO 27000, that's where the particular specific requirements for the particular management system are defined. And then Clause 9 and Clause 10, while not necessarily verbatim in definition and language, are very similar in practice, that for those of you who have other certifications will find very familiar. Okay. Now, there are a couple new things. Well, there are several new things, but specifically new clauses and new requirements in the ISO 20000 2018 standard that were not in the previous one. And that is specifically to some specific requirements around plan, the services and knowledge clause, and planning to achieve objectives. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple slides. But then there's also been some significant updates to the actions for addressing risk and opportunities, establishing objectives, communication, monitoring, measurement, and analysis, and then non-conformity and corrective action. Now, today, we're not going to have time, nor am I going to go through every change, but we will spend some time on some of the high level and some of the really, I think, what I will determine to be some of the important ones. Okay, so So with a new standard, the foundation for the 20,000 and the establishment of a service management system hasn't changed. Okay, the new standard doesn't change the approach. It doesn't change the methodology of what we're ultimately trying to do and what the requirement is, or what the standard is ultimately trying to demonstrate or provide guidance for. And it still is, establishing a service strategy, determining how the design of that service management system is going to be for your specific organization, how we manage the change, and how we deliver service, and then also how we continue to provide improvement, how we improve that service management system. Okay, so fear not with the new standard, the principles of it have not changed. Okay, so I'm providing this as sort of as a backdrop so you can sort of look at this against then and now, right? So this is specific to the old standard 2011, okay? And the principles of the standard were wrapped around the plan, do, check, act approach, okay? And those of you who have a certification already for 20,000 or 9,001 or any of the other standards will understand the plan, do, check, act, the Deming model will be very familiar to you. And this is kind of how in the old standard, this is how the clauses sort of broke down into where that activity was, okay? Again, planning was in 4 and 5, and services was in 6, and the checking was in the 7, 8, 9 clauses, and acting was in clause 4 with your improvement. So a background on that. So the plan, do, check, act has not gone away, but this is sort of how it looks in the new life cycle. Okay, and under the new standard. So clause 4, the context of organization and leadership and planning is where you're doing all your planning activity, right? Support to the SMS, which is clause 7, is where we're doing. Clause 8, operations of the SMS is where we're doing. Performance, clause 9, is where we're checking. Okay, this is your internal audit practices and everything like that. And then clause 10, which is improvement, is the act. This is where we're doing the improvement. This is where the change elements come into play, okay, outside of the change requirements and release requirements that happen in operations. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in a second as well. So I'm briefly going to go through a comparison of the 2018 and 2011, just so you guys can get a familiarity to this. Please note that this is not an exhaustive and an extensive list, okay? But I just want to highlight sort of so you get a relationship of where things have come to land in the new standard, right? So clause 4, the context of the organization, very much like 9001 and all the others, is where we get an understanding of the organization, where interested parties are identified, where we determine the scope of the system. The clauses from the old standard basically are inputted here, right? So clause 4.1, excuse the typo, clause 4.5.1, where we define scope, and business relationships was from clause 7.1. Those are all now moved over and housed in clause 4 of the new standard, okay? Clause 5, this is where we find the leadership commitment. This is where we get requirements to establish the policy, establish organizational roles and responsibilities. All these requirements are going to be familiar to you, okay? But they come from the old standard in different places. So now it's more of a streamlined activity and more of a readjustment of practice. And some of these are significant. The front end of this is not so much and very familiar, but when we get to the clause 7 and 8, you'll see on the next slide. Planning, and I'm going to point this out here as there's a couple new things here that we'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes. But the requirements in the 2018 standard, as I mentioned before, is there's a little bit more requirements wrapped around addressing risk and opportunities, and we'll talk about that. But then there's also new clause for plan to achieve objectives, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Okay, but you can see also where some of the clauses from the old standard, how they make where they come from, and where they now sit in the new standard of clause 6. Excuse me, I'm trying to get this thing to change. There we go. So clause 7, again, a lot of clause 7 was the front end of the old standard, but this is where we identify resources, determine the competences and the awareness, and where we set up our communication of both the service management system and the requirements that wrap around the management of the system. And we also have a new clause here, which is in regards to knowledge and knowledge management, and I'll talk a little bit about that here in a second as well. Okay. The big one here, and this is what I want to spend a little bit of time as well, is clause 8. Okay. So as those of you who have a current ISO 20000 certification and are familiar with the 2011 standard, you'll know that a lot of the activity for operation is scattered through the old standard. Okay, so the development and establishment of the service delivery approach in your catalog and the asset management, configuration management are found throughout. Design and transition and the requirements there are in clause 5 in the old standard, and the resolution and release practices are in clause 8 and all that. So what has really happened here now is the complete operation of a service management system from cradle to grave, and the requirements that go are both linear and streamlined and centrally located in one clause. So the workflow, the natural progression of a service management system makes a lot more sense. And some of this is my opinion as well, make a lot more sense in both definition and application with the standard by having everything seamlessly laid out in clause 8. So that's a big change, but I think it's a very valuable one. For the most part, the requirements have not changed. Some of the language and definitions have been reworded, but the principle and the application is still the same, and there really is not an enormous amount of variance from the old standard, but it is all compartmentalized into one clause now, which is very, very nice, to be honest with you. Clause 9, this is the monitoring and measurement activity. This is the internal audit and the management review and the service reporting. So a lot of this from the old standard comes from clause 4 and clause 6 and has been now put into clause 9. And then clause 10, again, like the new standards for 9001 and 27, is where we're doing corrective action and the continual improvement activity. And like everything else we've been talking to this point, the old standard had this sort of distributed across several clauses. Now it's really just coming back into one place. So let's talk a little bit. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the changes. Clause 6.2, which is the new requirements for planning to achieve objectives. Now, this is, in the old standard, we always had to identify what your objectives were for the service management system, okay? But what's coming into play now is with the establishment of your objectives is some follow-on activity where you're determining and planning on how you're going to achieve them, okay? And so what does that mean? It's setting around your objectives a plan for defining the objectives, monitoring and making sure that they're happening and you're achieving them, and then the evaluation of performance against those objectives, right? And that's a relatively new thing in the ISO world, but with a new annex and the new standards, a focus on that. And really that focuses on when we're planning to achieve the objectives, one, what will they be? But also, what are the resources that I need to implement these objectives and manage these objectives? Who will be responsible for this kind of stuff? Or who will be responsible for monitoring? Who owns the objectives? Also, what is my evaluation of objectives? So some of you who are on this webinar, I know, and we've had these conversations before, but objectives should be measurable. And the case holds true here is when I establish my service management system objectives, they should have a measurable component to it so that I can begin evaluating the performance of them and my ability, the performance in achieving those objectives. So a new standard or a new requirement for ISO 20000 that wasn't there before, not overly difficult, but something that needs to be paid attention to. So it is a new step. The other one is clause 7.6, which is knowledge. Okay, and with this, not really all we're looking for, all the standard is looking for, is you as an organization in reference to the service management system are making determinations of what's necessary to maintain, what knowledge associated with the service management system is necessary for me to maintain. Okay, and that relevant information, that relevant data, how are we holding it? How are we making it usable? How are we making it available to those that participate in the service management system, the service management or the service owners, and all of my interested parties, whether they be internal or external? Okay. Aside from that, the standard's not giving any more definition of what the requirements are. It's not saying what knowledge you need to keep. That's still for you to determine. But that exercise of knowledge collection, storage, and retainment needs to be an activity that becomes part of the overall management of the service system. So some of the updates. So there's some additional things. The standard or the requirements were always there, but they sort of have continued to evolve. And certainly one of them, and in my opinion, one of the biggest one is risks. Okay, I feel that there are significant updates to risk and opportunity practice. So before, much like the ISO 9001 standard, there was always some relative requirement for identifying risks, okay? But now the standard requirement, or the requirements of the standard for risk, is going a little bit further. And it is asking for one, identification of risks and opportunities that are associated with the service management system. But then what are we doing to manage it? Okay, so evaluation of impact on the customer, whether that customer is internal or external. Establishment of a risk acceptance criteria and the approach that I'm taking to manage the risks. Okay, so again, it's a continued evolution. You're starting to see a little bit more. For those of you who have a ISO 20000 certification and are familiar with 27, you remember that there always was a relationship with the risk assessment activity and between the 27 and ISO 20000. But this is going so there's this continued evolution here of identification of risk, risk assessment, and management of risk for 20,000 now. Excuse me. And then also really a continued plan requirement for the actions that we identify, what we're going to be doing to, in all intents and purposes, mitigating risks, what they are and how we are making determinations of evaluating that the actions we're taking are effective at mitigating these risks. So there is a little bit more here now than historically had been before. Something to consider. Okay. The objectives we talked about already. Some additional requirements around communication. Nothing too significant, but other than we are making a little bit more effort towards the establishment of communication plans, what we'll communicate, when, with whom, and how. Most organizations, most companies that we have worked with and been working with for some time, some of you are on the phone now, or on this webinar now. We always, ITG here, the consultants have always sort of pushed for a communication practice. This falls right in line, but there are some additional requirements here that even though we were doing it before, weren't necessarily full requirements. Now they are. And then again, as we're talking about this, of course, with some of the additional requirements around risks and the monitoring and control capabilities, that are associated with that, the requirements around monitoring and measurement have sort of beefed up a little bit. I'm not going to go into any great detail about that, but just know that there are some new things there, or some, not necessarily new things, but additional definitions around the requirements. One thing that ISO has done now, or IO, International Organizational Standards, has done is really also begin to simplify the clauses. And we've seen actually over the last couple of years, whether it's ISO or whether it's CMMI, a real push to that. So instead of it being an exercise of theory and methodology and a quality environment, it is moving and trying to move to make it much more business centric and operationally defined language and definitions. And we're starting to see that with this new standard as well. A lot of, as well as, again, those of you that are certified with ISO 9001 2015, with that transition, you also know that there was a significant reduction in the required documents that needed to be published. We see that again with the ISO 20000. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the procedures and the process documentation and my plans and policies all get thrown out the window, because a lot of some of the easiest way to demonstrate that I'm doing something is to have that in place. But the standard is moving away from making those required documents or those required things and focusing much more on how you do something instead of defining what it is that you will do to demonstrate how. So it leaves it to the organization to make those definitions and demonstrate those practices. Okay. The objectives we talked about and planning for sort of defining and managing those. And then, as we talked about as well, there's been this certain continued evolution of alignment with the information security definitions from ISO 27000. Those are still there and continue to evolve. Nothing new, Nothing that goes against what historically has been there, but it is just a continued interrelationship for information security here at 20,000 to match to 27. So the timelines, everybody's probably more interested in this than anything else. So this past September was the release of the new standard. And that begins the clock for the start of the transition period. So much like the transition for 9001 2015, we have a 2-year sunset period. And right now, ISO is planning for end of September 2020 to sunset the 2011 standard. The easiest thing to do, the most effective thing to do, is certainly have conversations with, if you're working with us, ITG, and your certifying body, or if you don't have a certifying body yet and you want to start the process, certainly contact us and we'll start helping you make the that transition and looking for an effective timeline and when it makes sense for you and your organization to transition to the new standard. Just like 9001, there's no reason to go racing out there and do it and get out of cycle, but certainly plan for it. And we are certainly here to help you and work with you on managing that transition and updating anything that needs to be updated, and helping audit against that for your recertification and transition. So I'm going to spend just a couple minutes. I know I feel probably most of you all who are on this webinar already have your certifications, and the reasons you're here is you want to know what's changing and what I have to do to fix anything. And I would say as of today, you don't need to do anything, but certainly start planning for the change, the transition. And as I mentioned, we're certainly here to help for that. And for those of you who don't have a certification, are thinking about now working on establishing a service management system, there are a lot of reasons to do that. Primarily, probably one of the most important ones for a lot of the companies that we work with in the area is that it tends to be a distinguishing qualifier and or a requirement from the federal sector. And in these competitive markets, having these certifications and the ability to demonstrate delivery of service and product is a distinguishing qualifier. And with customer demands and expectations, it certainly is something that you need to focus on, something to think about. And those of us who have those certifications, it is all the reason why to maintain those certifications. If you've already established a service management system, or if you haven't, this exercise of, especially with the new standard, this is an exercise here of establishing a service management system. This is an exercise you probably want to go through again. How does this changes to the standard affect our strategy for service delivery? Does it at all? Does it impact how our system is set? It certainly will affect and have input into how we establish our objectives and policy and how we manage those things. The service management plan, our approach to the management of the SMS, who does what. Some of those things now with the new, some of the new requirements are going to require a little bit more definition and rigor around identifying those resources and those assignments. And certainly the communication aspect of this is a more robust element under the new standard than it existed previously, but it still is part of, and always has been, some element of establishing and setting up and managing a service management system. So, a lot of these things here that we have laid out, while they were applicable to 2011, are still applicable to the new standard and are still continually applicable to the overall management of my service management system, irregardless of how long I've had it and how long it's been up and running. These are checks and balances that I should run through on a fairly regular basis with a level of cadence that makes sure that these things are continually improving and evolving. So we talked about, some of the considerations of setting this up, but these are the things that we always want to have in our head, and through the management of it, whether I'm doing it for the first time in the design of a service management system, or it's my annual review or my quarterly review of systems, my service management performance. These are the things that we want to make sure that we have it in place, and it has not changed for the new standard. These are still the improvement considerations and vehicles that we want to have in place to make sure that the performance of our service management system is one, on point to the metrics that we've established, but then also is still doing what we want it to do, is still providing a value to the business direction and strategic goals of the company. Okay, so these are always a continual checks and balances that we want to go through. So I'm not going to necessarily really go through any of the lessons learned, but we have been doing this. ITG, the consultants here, have been doing this for quite some time, years and years now, and we do really have a real understanding of service management systems, but also the services of a wide variety of organizations. And no organization is the same. Everyone has a unique way of determining their direction and their introduction and involvement in the market. So service management systems should be unique to the organization themselves. And understanding you and working with you to help define what those services are and what that management system is, that's what the support that we bring, and that's what the value that should be added to this exercise. A lot of this also is in line, making sure that we're in line with your schedule and the capabilities of the organization, and we don't want to wait. Don't wait till the last minute to set these things up. Certainly some of these things are always driven by resources, whether they be financial resources or human or technical resources, and the availability to effectively help implement and manage these things. But we do get these requests a lot, and we have organizations out there that come to us and say, hey, I need this certification, and oh, by the way, I need it in next month. Well, we're too far down the road for that to effectively provide any support to you and be successful without huge risk. So, as leaders of your organizations, and if you have service management systems already in place that are either you want to get certified or are certified, plan these activities accordingly, and give yourself the time to do the due diligence and be effective and mitigate the risk, so that either a new certification or the transition is successful. Okay. The benefits of the certification, they speak for themselves. It's globally recognized. The certifications give assurances to your customers that one, you have a defined and repeatable and quantifiable service practice where what you're delivering to your customers is of the utmost quality, and it's repeatable, and you can continue to do it, and it's available based upon defined parameters that everybody agrees to. And we all know from a business development side, having these certifications gives you a distinguishing qualifier, but then also allows you, in some circumstances, allows you to actively bid in certain scenarios and are prerequisites. So, having these things are always of benefit and should always be of value and benefit to you. Okay. So that is all we have. We got through that relatively quickly. I am going to open up to see if we have any questions. If you have any questions, please go ahead and answer or ask them now. We are going to put together a little, Q&A of some things that we think are important and things that should be considered. And for those of you who are on the webinar, we'll make sure that we get those out to you. And we also will be sending out this presentation for the webinar. If you all currently, is there no questions? I will end the webinar here, and I hope that everybody has a wonderful holiday and happy Thanksgiving. And I hope to talk to each and one of you very soon. And if you have anything or you need anything, we are here. And have a great afternoon, rest of the day. Thank you.